Have you ever had that weird feeling where you've just finished and your computer screen's still up and you're just a bit like, I enjoyed looking at that. I derived pleasure from that. And you close the tab as quick as possible and the post-nut clarity kicks in and you just feel a bit sick, a bit shameful, a bit disgusted with yourself. I think most of us have been there and it's so confusing. Why am I even trying to use that word in this video? Yeah, you're just like baffled by your decision to look at that weird stuff. And it all makes sense when we gain a new perspective on the reason that we were looking at that content. And we have to start off with understanding the ego, or these parts within us. So we'll take it back in time to when I was younger. I grew up in Sheffield in England. My mum and dad came from different backgrounds. My dad was Jewish and my mum was Christian. After a bit of back and forth, they settled on having me circumcised. And I was the only Jewish kid in my school, the only Jewish kid that I really knew growing up. And one day, around the age of 8, I had a friend called Ali. He was one of my best friends at the time. And he asked me, "Are you circumcised?" And honestly, I was like, I don't know, circumcision, what does that mean? Like, I'm an 8-year-old. What am I meant to say? I honestly had no idea I was circumcised. I genuinely just did not know anything about my own penis at that point. And the years went by, I came to realise I was circumcised, and I remember walking home around the age of 13 with some friends, and they were talking about how disgusting, how gross, how painful circumcision must be, and how they were grateful that they weren't. But I never told any of those guys that I was Jewish. So at primary school, my dad used to come in and do talks on Judaism. And that's how people knew I was Jewish then. But then in secondary school, that all stopped. I didn't really need to tell anyone I was Jewish. So I kind of kept that secret a bit to myself. In fact, I remember one day at KFC, I had a friend who was very naively talking about circumcision. And he actually thought that the whole bell end, like the top of the penis, was chopped off. And he thought that's what circumcision was. So, a lot of people talking about this stuff, they didn't really know what they were on about. But I just kept it all to myself and felt a lot of shame and guilt and like a total outsider. A few years went by, I joined this football team. And I remember walking up to school with a friend who was joining the team at the time. And I was saying to him, "Oh yeah, these are my aspirations for the new season. I'm going to be like one of the best players. I'm going to train really hard throughout summer. I'm going to work really hard." And I was super ambitious, but also very, very egotistical. And he went off, told some guys what I'd been saying, and they started to bitch about me and say, "Oh yeah, he's not that good, blah, blah, blah." And so I left that team and I felt like a total outsider once again, very lonely, quite rejected. And if I'm honest, when I look back and I realised like why I was even saying such egotistical things, it was totally because I felt insecure at the time. It was because I felt isolated in my own struggle and I wanted to belong. I wanted someone's approval. I wanted to feel like I was part of something. That's why I wanted to get better at football back then. It wasn't really because I wanted to be the best player or anything like that. I just wanted to be accepted. And so behind our ego is often something a lot deeper. This all started for me when I was like 8 years old and I realized I was different to all the other kids. So instead of just hating our ego and like seeing it as the enemy, like in a lot of books and content nowadays. So I read like Ryan Holiday's book a few years ago called Ego is the Enemy. And there's some good points in that book, but I just think the process to getting the results that he wants people to get is totally flawed because we're not accepting that part into our life. We're not listening to that part of us. And there's a really good story which Richard Schwartz tells in the book No Bad Parts. And Richard Schwartz was a family therapist. So what he says in his book No Bad Parts, which I highly, highly recommend if you're trying to quit porn, is that at first I tried to get clients to relate to these parts in a way that would shut them out or get them to stop. For example, I suggested ignoring the critical part or arguing with it. So that's very similar to this whole concept of ego is the enemy. You're trying to fight and argue with that part of yourself. This approach just made things worse, but I didn't know what else to do than encourage them to fight harder to win their inner battles. I had one client who had a part that made her cut her wrists. Well, I couldn't stand for that. My client and I badgered the part in one session for a couple of hours until it agreed not to cut her wrists anymore. I left that session feeling drained, but satisfied that we had won the battle. I opened the door to our next session and my client had a big gash across her face. I collapsed emotionally at that point and spontaneously said, "I give up. I can't beat you at this." And the part shifted too and said, "I don't really want to beat you." So that was a big turning point in Richard Schwartz's work, because he then realised that actually this part of us, this ego as it's often called, is really just a suffering part. It's something within us which is often hurt, often gone through trauma. And so for some people, they may have been abused in childhood and they may be cutting their wrists because it gives them some sort of control, some kind of escape from that intense emotion. And that child within us is just getting hated and tormented and criticised. And that child within us was only maybe 7 or 8 when it got abused or when it went through some kind of trauma. And so by hurting and inflicting more and more hate and pain onto that part, it actually comes back even stronger. And that's how one of his clients ended up cutting a gash across her own face, because that part just needed to be heard. And so when that client was arguing with that part and hating on it even more and being more aggressive, tormenting it, well, it came back and it just lashed out even more. So there's these parts within us, and often they're a lot younger than we think they are, and we just need to care and support for them, be there for them, and actually approach them with this curious, compassionate, mindful approach. It's one that's not talked about enough, but this is the solution. This is the solution to quitting pornography, is being curious with ourselves and being kind and calm and confident, and to be able to say to that part within us, "Okay, I understand where you're coming from. Can you tell me more about that?" And help it. And then once you get into a better relationship with that part of yourself, you can let it sort of sit back and actually let you take control again. That's why I'm able to talk about these parts within me that are hard, because I've earned their trust. I've earned my own trust. That's why I'm able to be so vulnerable on this camera right now. It's simply because I've had these internal conversations and I've managed to let those parts let me take the lead and be in self right now and be in this energy right now where I feel confident and I feel good and I feel comfortable talking to you guys about some really deep stuff that's happened for me in the past. And I feel like I can tell you guys anything because these parts are letting me do so. But often those parts want to protect us. That's what their job is. So they want to protect us from these extreme, horrible emotions that we once suffered. And that's why they take over and can be very egotistical, self-obsessed and narcissistic, and can overcompensate in ways that we don't want them to. But the parts themselves aren't bad. It's the way in which they act to try and protect us and help us, which is bad. And so when I was struggling in the past and I turned to porn, that was actually that part just trying to do its best to help me escape really intense, horrible emotions. It was trying to help me, and it just didn't know an effective way of doing that, because from a very young age, the way that I would escape was through porn. And so it learned that behaviour, that to escape horrible, intense emotions of rejection and loneliness and isolation, the best way to do that for me was to run away and look at pornography. But as I've become an adult, I've realised that's no longer serving me, and that's why I need to make peace with that part so that it can let go and no longer carry on escaping and carry on doing the things I don't really want it to do. So that's the solution. We have to start loving these parts of ourselves, otherwise we'll never be truly free from our own afflictions and the conflicts that we create within ourselves. I do hope this video has been useful. Subscribe for more, because there's a lot more of this sort of stuff coming, and I'll see you in the next video.